Okay, so let's get started. So good morning and good afternoon to all of you around the world. So my name is Udith Dematagoda. I'm a modernist literature scholar and I'm based in Tokyo at Waseda University. And I'm joined by my co-author and co-host Christos Asomatos, as an art historian based in Athens, and I believe is currently on holiday at the moment on a Greek island. And it's keeping it very secret where it is, but doesn't want the paparazzi involved, I imagine. So this is the first, the inaugural lecture of the Ideology and Aesthetics Research Network, which Christos and I started with some colleagues and friends based in various parts of the world. And it's part of a kind of, hopefully, a very sort of full and interesting program of public lectures called New Perspectives in Ideology and Aesthetics. So we kind of conceived of this idea in 2020 in September, and the goal is to explore kind of new and then speculative theories that kind of relate to this ever-changing contemporary situation, which is distinguished by technological alienation, a great degree of abstraction, and various destabilized modes of perception. So today, the title of today's talk, The Ideological Aesthetic, the Political as Inevitable and Epiphenomenal, is in fact also the title of the article which Christos and I co-authored and which will be published hopefully very soon. So the essay will begin by addressing a very brief theoretical text, fairly brief, published within the last few years. In 2016 is the Exform by the French curator and art critic Nicholas Bourriaud. It's a very slight and kind of very speculative work, and it presents in its own way an opportunity for Bourriaud to revisit and even at times to kind of recant some of the views he expressed in his own highly influential work, Relational Aesthetics from 1998. Maybe inevitably, perhaps, the X-form was kind of obscured by the sort of miasma of other works, primarily journalistic, also academic, of course, that focused on responding immediately, and that's perhaps a little incoherently, to the very absurdist kind of political theater of the Trump era. The work itself, rather unfashionably, as Bourriaud himself kind of admitted, owed much to the work of the philosopher Louis Althusser. Despite the fact, in Bourriaud's own words, that Althusser hardly meets the requirements of the contemporary jet set of philosophy, he does concede that an engagement with Althusser's work is inescapable if one seeks to, and I quote, problematize relations between aesthetics and politics, form and theory, and ideology and praxis. So we use the X-form as a means in this paper to approach the kind of Althusserian source material. And we do so primarily to sort of emphasize Althusser's continued sort of relevance to contemporary theoretical discussions, and secondly, to contrast some of Althusser's positions and the surprising also continuities with those of the German jurist and very controversial political philosopher Carl Schmitt. Finally, we'll attempt to kind of utilize these discussions towards our own tentative and speculative theory of the ideological aesthetic, which we propose as a lacuna of past theoretical discourse on the subject of ideology. And of course, I'm presenting, as I said, this paper today with my collaborator and co-author, Christos Asomatos, who also will give a couple of preliminary remarks soon before getting into the paper. And I will pick up the thread a little bit later on in the discussion as well. So we hope the transition between us two will be as seamless as possible. We'll at different points have to switch between our different shared screens. So hopefully there won't be, but there may be some slight glitches. So please bear with us and we'll take questions at the end. Christos.
Good morning and good afternoon from me too. Picking up on where Udith stopped, let's first introduce like the Exform, what the Exform by Nicolas Bourriaud was about. The Exform as a book addresses the perennial problematic of aesthetics and politics, a topic which, although rather out of favor in mainstream scholarship in recent years, may well come to define this current period in history. It is a theoretical discourse that is simultaneously acknowledged as important in making sense of the chaotic technological paradigm which we inhabit, while at the same time it is precluded or held at a distance because of its rather rarefied lexicon and terminology. The aesthetic sphere, however, has rapidly become one of the primary means through which ideology is disseminated in our oversaturated digital cultures, and has untold effects not only on the perception, reception, and production of a variety of cultural forms, but also on our everyday political discourse. In the mouths of true digital natives, those who cannot remember a time without the internet, the aesthetic is used in a manner much removed from the old theory of disinterestedness that we encounter in like writers, philosophers such as like Immanuel Kant, most notably Immanuel Kant. Instead, the aesthetic nowadays has become inextricably bound up in the perceptual foundations which were its actual etymological origins. It eschews, therefore, the contemplative, and because of the sheer volume of judgments demanded by an oversaturated digital native, it has become a form of practical endeavor once more. So this paper that we will be presenting to you will attempt to outline a theory which seeks to provide the basis for an engagement with the various ways in which ideology becomes indistinguishable from its aesthetic effects, the conditions in which aesthetics and ideology become equivalent to and interchangeable with each other, and finally, some possible implications of this phenomena. So at this stage, I'm gonna, after this small introduction, I'm gonna share my screen and we'll continue on and we'll continue with some basic propositions that Nicholas Bourriaud makes in the Exform published in 2016, which will eventually lead to the core of the discussion. All right, give me a second. All right, so despite technological capitalism's attempts to usher in a seamless world without friction, we are, as Bourriaud himself maintains in the book, living in an overfull world of refuse, surrounded by things and phenomena. For Bourriaud, this is exemplified in such telling images and concepts such as junk bonds and toxic assets, which capital uses to refer to its own repressed waste. The fundamental starting hypothesis of Bourriaud is that the real of globalism is haunted by the specter of what is unproductive or unprofitable. The writer begins with an perhaps overly inclusive definition of a new proletariat of precarity, which is no longer found only in factories. And he extrapolates further to include those deprived of experience and compelled by consumerism to replace ontological certainty with a possession of commodities. Bourriaud then proceeds to offer a rather pious nod towards the plight of marginalized, let's say, social entities such as undocumented immigrants, refugees, and the homeless as harbingers of the new proletariat par excellence, which have apparently taken the place, at least to an extent, the place of Marx' proletarian within the collective imagination. So Bourriaud begins as his starting hypothesis with this, let's say, proclamation of the repressed and the unprofitable and the marginalized as gaining some the valence of a revolutionary subject. One field specifically where this redefinition of the repressed and the unwanted as a potential revolutionary subject takes hold, as Bourriaud suggests, is the field of contemporary art, which subsequently calls for a new examination of the relation between art and politics. This forms the basis for, let's say, a working definition of the main concept that, of the headline concept that Bourriaud utilizes in the Exform, which is the exformal. Bourriaud defines the exformal as the site where border negotiations unfold between what is rejected and what is admitted culturally. By assigning the conflict between what is rejected and what is admitted such a central role in his political theory of art, Bourriaud seeks at the first level to expand the critical significance of art's devalued matter, which has proven historically indispensable to the evolution of modernist aesthetics across various mediums. But secondly, Bourriaud uses this concept of the exformal, or the devalued matter, as a political parallelism to the new proletariat of precarity, and thirdly, psychoanalytically, to the concept of repression. So it is a, let's say, like a multi-layered concept. As a general note on his political theory of art, or on rather the political theory of art, which emerges out of the pages of the Exformal, an art theory which elevates the interplay or opposition between what is rejected and what is culturally admitted as a driving mechanism for cultural production is not a particularly novel one. In truth, his own premise to an extent echoes writers such as Boris Groys and Groys's division between the spheres of the sacred and the profane, and perhaps even Adorno's intricate system of a perpetually self-transgressing modernist autonomy. What separates Bourriaud's theory from writers such as the aforementioned is that he seeks to carve out a niche for himself by enlisting Althusser, as Udith already mentioned, whose philosophy he interprets as traversing the distance between the psychoanalytic and the political. As we will discover later on, however, Althusser's own concept of ideology, which is obviously central to Bourriaud's project, is more complex and mutable than it might first appear. So let's continue on with some comments that Bourriaud makes on art, and more specifically contemporary art. One of the main tools, theoretical tools that he uses, is this idea of the constellation motif. It is actually his introduction of the constellation motif as a process in contemporary art, which most explicitly evokes Althusser's work on the relationship between the unconscious and history, as outlined in Althusser's posthumous The Underground Current of Materialism, of the Materialism of the Encounter. So, what is exactly the constellation motif? The constellation motif is the concept that Bourriaud employs to describe the particularly reticular forms of contemporary art that he encounters in contemporary art, which tend to be composed of the relegated and expunged material of this overfull world of refuse that Bourriaud builds upon as his starting hypothesis. Bourriaud detects the constellation motif in the work of artists such as Sarah Zez, Jason Rhodes, Mike Keeley, among others. And it emerges as an internet era embodiment of the logic of the psychoanalytic symptom and its revelation of repressed meaning. At the second level, however, because of the, let's say, of the reticular form of the constellation motif, Bourriaud extrapolates it to also present in a way reconstructions of defeated timelines, of defeated historical timelines. So the elements of the constellation motif, elements which are forgotten, repressed, relegated, expunged, etc., echo certain histories, let's say, which are not the prevalent histories, do not fit in the prevalent framework through which we interpret our present time and our progression to our present time. So in this sense, the constellation motif stands in a way as a visualization of Althusser's aleatory understanding of history, which is Althusser's perception of history as a site with no beginning or end predictable through recourse to dialectical or mechanistic processes. And it is a history which also becomes perceptible only through the chance collision of disparate elements materialized through their encounter. This understanding of history, free from the shackles of the dialectical and the mechanistic, presents a key aporia to human agency and action. Just as it technically liberates the subject from the shackles of the predetermined by underlining the illusion of inevitability, it also exposes the subject to a realm of freedom that can only be grasped after the acceptance of politics as a void. The constellation motif, as the art critic maintains, responds to this problem of human agency and action positively, escaping thus the sense of emptiness, which would otherwise relegate the subject to a state of political irresponsibility. Nevertheless, Bourriaud's election of the void as the basis of art history appears to be more of an abstract observation on perhaps the infinite number of theoretical directions that could be followed, as opposed to a definite and definitive philosophical alignment. Interestingly, the aleatory element that Bourriaud seeks to elevate, to underline in his examples of contemporary art, appears to be rather at odds with somewhat intelligible institutional genealogies that his elected artworks follow. Indeed, Bourriaud appears to use this concept of the void as the ex nihilo, a reaction between basic elements which set off history, but overlooks Althusser's key precondition, which is that the fundamental reaction between random elements does not equate a chaotic and infinite chain of events, symbolically defying the victims of history, but survives and evolves insofar as every encounter that endures and takes hold produces a structure that has primacy over its various elements. The problems, notwithstanding, in Bourriaud's political theory of art, nevertheless point towards make it clear what Bourriaud's objective is in this text, which is the production of a political theory of art which problematizes agency, action, and history away from the simplistic recourse to denouncing mechanisms of authority and repression. And this is perhaps the crux of the Exform itself, an attempt to steer what we understand as critical artistic activity away from the facile and overt political positioning of recent years, which has left the political and artistic discourse unable to separate authorial intent from artistic merit. Following Althusser, Bourriaud seems to highlight that in fact, the political function of contemporary art lies in its bringing the world into a precarious state. The purpose of this function is to expose what Bourriaud describes as the circumstantial nature of the institutions that structure social life. Furthermore, this function of contemporary art is opposed to the semblance, to the appearance of definitiveness produced by the various ideological state apparatuses within capitalism. Affirming, therefore, the precarity of the world keeps alive the notion of possibility of intervention. This formulation of Bourriaud is clearly related to the highly speculative response which Althusser provided to André Daspe in his Letter of Art of 1966, where Althusser states that authentic art provides no knowledge of the reality of the world, but instead makes us see, makes us perceive, makes us feel something which alludes to reality. More specifically, to quote, what art makes us see and therefore gives to us in the form of seeing, perceiving, and feeling, which is not the form of knowing, is the ideology from which it is born, in which it bathes, from which it detaches itself as art, and to which it alludes. However, Althusser's delineation of the realms of the ideological and the aesthetic is a great deal more protean than this letter might suggest. And indeed, as we shall be forced to confront, more recent readings of Althusser have revealed that the mechanisms which produce the aesthetic effect of art are similar to the mechanism which produced ideology itself. In this particular vein, it is useful to turn to one specific section of the Exform, which contains an interesting comment made in passing. According to Bourriaud, contemporary art is haunted by its inability to think about the way things are. It evinces boundless nostalgia for modernism, a discourse calling for ideas and action, criticism, and engagement. Indeed, we would be at great pains to quantify the effects of art on society. According to the prevailing ideology of pragmatism, which recognizes only numbers and tangible effects, that is enough to disqualify art's political pretensions. Art, the very site where ideology is laid bare, has become the space where the politics is deployed, where it becomes a matter of display value, pure and simple. The positions that artists take are all the more extreme because no one believes they can have the slightest effect on the real, which is cemented by ideology. So, this is also the crux, I'd say the point of departure for the ensuing discussion that we will have. First of all, overlooking the rather idiosyncratic conflation of modernism at large and the historical avant-garde which emerges in this text, which is a conflation that the writer has indulged in all the way back to his Relational Aesthetics of 1998. This assertion of this small paragraph is not developed beyond an observational level. Given the otherwise committed readings of Althusser, which this work contains, it remains surprising that Bourriaud makes no attempt to link this observation with an interrogation of the very terms with which it is concerned. The so-called nostalgia for modernism, much like the pastiches of so-called postmodernism, are in fact re-emergences, reappearances of modernist aesthetics modulated through what Mark Fisher would have referred to as an ontological prism. Yet beyond this well-noted designation, there remains another unexplored possibility initiated by the compulsory pragmatism which Bourriaud has identified. A compulsory pragmatism which forecloses the otherwise demystifying function of aesthetic production. To simplify, to make things a bit simpler here, the problem lies in the fact that even if, as Bourriaud underlines here, contemporary art seems to be unable to reveal the mystifications of contemporary life in its political engagements, this Bourriaud avoids tackling with the problem of why is contemporary art so intent on creating forms of political engagement. So if it is so unsuccessful, why does it keep doing it in, in a few words? And if it keeps doing it, does that not reveal something deeper about it, about art itself, and perhaps about our present conditions? So as a theorist of depoliticization, Bourriaud underlines that the predominant ideology of our times dictates the separation of politics and economics, which is a separation concomitant with the barring of politics from the sphere of impactfulness and the subsequent naturalization of economics as the domain of the inevitable. No real surprise can follow this observation. Effectively, the process which Bourriaud outlines as the enshrinement of every meaningful decision in the economic dogma of pragmatism amounts to a very common critique of capitalist depoliticization. Interestingly, in terms of the inscription of this phenomenon in art production, Bourriaud locates the explicitly engaged character of many contemporary art practices precisely in the spirit of pragmatism, which anchors social life in conditions of depoliticization. There are indeed ample reasons to cultivate this suspicion, and especially with regards to programmatically socially ameliorative tendencies in contemporary art practice. There are few artistic statements. I'm sorry. All right, so there are few artistic statements which cast this correlation between artistic activity and efficiency and pragmatism, as Bourriaud says, as sharply as the contemporary Arte Util movement and its leader, Tanya Bruguera's proclamation that for Arte Util, failure is not a possibility. If the project fails, it is not Arte Util. Arte Util, to introduce the term, describes an international network of artists and artist groups centering on the idea of usefulness or usership. So Arte Util is this umbrella term that describes socially engaged art practices which focus on delivering actual socially ameliorative results to the communities that it engages with. The triumphalist rhetoric of such assertions for Arte Util, failure is not a possibility. If the project fails, it is not Arte Util, should not divert from what is exactly on display here, which is a conceptualization of the social character of contemporary art, which cannot be coherently articulated as distinct from other types of social work. One of the earliest formulations of the philosophy of Arte Util, Tania Bruguera's Immigrant Movement International, which started in 2010-2011, saw the artist, in fact, move away from the original intention to run art workshops in the Corona neighborhood of Queens, New York, to focus instead on the more immediate needs of the immigrant population, such as English lessons or job finding, let's say, job searching workshops. So the artist, faced with what was perceived as a failure in the form of absence of engagement from the local community, reframed and repurposed the project towards the pursuit of pure practical impact. This explicit association of artistic practice with a binary logic of success and failure, which is itself peculiar to the administration of tasks consisting of specific steps and outcomes, and its subsequent judgment against criteria of this kind, presupposes without a doubt a profoundly instrumentalized conceptualization of art. And this is a type of instrumentalization which does not simply subvert the old oppressive Kantian doxa of art's purposive purposelessness. Rather, it illustrates a line of thinking that ultimately leaves these art practices unable to justify a unique role and value as distinct from the action of various social welfare programs and NGOs, beyond perhaps the vanity of artists attached to the idea of being useful. The imperative of efficiency is itself a consequence of a relatively recent and wide structural transformation of arts funding networks. As George Udith has argued, the deregulatory orthodoxy of neoliberal economic policy has created adequate incentives for artists and arts bodies to safeguard their standing through the adoption of social functions well outside the role of art in traditional cultural contexts. Projecting, therefore, a character of public service by pivoting to social and pedagogic programs is one avenue art institutions are often forced to explore amid massive cuts in arts and culture budgets. At the same time, attaching oneself onto the socially useful tendencies in cultural production allows many artists to carve out a new social role away from the navel-gazing, exhaustive manipulation of intradisciplinary tropes and signs. While the medium and specificity of contemporary art has allowed it to assume the directly efficient structure of activism, literary production has pursued a similar goal in different ways. Indeed, a parallel but comparable process has taken place in the publishing industry within the past 20 years. Motivated by dwindling profits, the disappearance of pricing protections, the emergence of Amazon as a retail and self-publishing platform, the publishing industry has itself adopted its own program of pragmatism and efficiency towards the genre of literary fiction by imposing onto it a putatively social function. To take a specific example, minority authors of literary fiction have in recent years been increasingly instrumentalized by publishers in this quasi-revolutionary drive towards representation as a reified form of activism. In more general terms, the publishing industry swiftly reflects and responds to the transient demands of political scandal, identitarianism, and the undulations of public outrage. Individual authorship within this context has ceased to be the primary factor in a work's literariness. So, Bourriaud basically outlines a picture comprised of a nexus of idealism, economic compulsion, and a calculated over-eagerness to adapt to political expedience. And this nexus is what underlies the what Bourriaud describes as the quantifiable, effective politics of contemporary artistic production. Nevertheless, the writer does not seem content with limiting the logic of efficiency and pragmatism solely to outright socially ameliorative practices. In fact, he extends it in an admittedly elliptical manner to also encompass aspects of artistic activity regularly understood in a more adversarial light. Alluding thus to the discourse on artistic antagonism that followed the publication of his Relational Aesthetics in 1998, wherein writers such as Claire Bishop counterposed the provocation of artists such as Santiago Serra to Bourriaud's own more convivial preferences, Bourriaud appears to insinuate that there is indeed a convergence between amelioration and oppositionality as political orientations of cultural production. And it is a convergence which lies in ameliorations and oppositionalities' spectacular participation in a now depoliticized political sphere. Consequently, the picture that Bourriaud is painting is one permitted by processes of de-differentiation between the cultural and the political, expressed primarily in the expansion of the sphere of the political, or rather the expansion of the dependency of the cultural on the political, which unfolds in parallel to the diminishing of the impact of political decision. However, the implication of this double movement of expansion and disempowerment cannot be covered adequately only through vague references to ideology, as Bourriaud had done by when he underlined that art cannot really make any impact politically because the real of politics is cemented through ideology. And it is a double movement of expansion and disempowerment that far surpasses the acknowledgement of the self-evident limits of contemporary art's political power, which after all often haunts discourse as a refutation of an illusion without honor. Basically, no one really expects art to actually transform the political conditions of modern life. So the point should not be to refute an already disprove, let's say, hypothesis that art can transform in a revolutionary manner the conditions of political life, but to rather examine why, if art is bound to fail in this project, why does it keep attempting it? Does that reflect anything that is worth considering about the wider socio-political context that a contemporary art operates in? So, following this line of thinking, we can arrive at a formulation which contradicts the more commonplace assumption that the prevalent economization of contemporary life has shrunk the penetration of politics into socio-cultural matters. This is also a formulation which seemingly inadvertently evokes Carl Schmitt's own understanding of the structure of the political and its relation to other fields of social life. In his probably most famous articulations of the basis of the political in his own political philosophy, Carl Schmitt asserted that the specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. Schmitt therefore famously defined the fundamental condition of the political as the ability of a distinction to mobilize two entities into a grouping of friend and enemy. This constitutes, as Schmitt disclaimed, no exhaustive definition of the political, but its specific criterion. Although the writer's early attempts at delineating the concept were marked with certain inconsistencies in terms of its relationship to other spheres of human thought and action, inconsistencies which were identified by Leo Strauss already in 1932, Schmitt gradually moved toward a re-articulation of the political, not as an independent domain, but as a degree of intensity. Science, in the 1932, in the second edition of the book, Schmitt states the following: the real friend and enemy grouping is existentially so strong and decisive that the non-political antithesis, at precisely the moment at which it becomes political, pushes aside and subordinates its hitherto purely religious, purely economic, purely cultural criteria and motives to the conditions and conclusions of the political situation at hand. What does it mean? This means that the political, in Schmitt's analysis, emerges as the field of antagonism and antithesis once the polarization that this antagonism and antithesis creates is strong enough in order to divide groups of people into relationships of friendship and enmity. So the friend and enemy distinction is reframed as superior to every other possible one, and once its generative antagonism reaches the level of intensity necessary for it, it takes over all original disagreements and politicizes them. This formulation marks a breakthrough in Schmitt's critique, as it posits the political against the prevailing liberal organization of human thought and action in the form of autonomous, specialized domains. In contrast, the political appears in Schmitt's theory to exist as a potentiality in a quasi-parasitic relationship with those spheres traditionally designated as non-political, that is, the spheres of religion, economy, and culture. Being fundamentally constituted by its polemical intentions, Schmitt's critique was primarily directed against the ideological principles of liberalism, as those were embodied in the laissez-faire character of the 19th century liberal state. Liberal thought, Schmitt claimed, provides the ideological space for the erosion of the political. It degrades the political concept of battle into competition in the domains of economics and discussion in the intellectual realm. That is, through ideological operations that Schmitt described as neutralizations, liberal thought facilitates the sublimation of political conflict into domains where the distinction between friend and enemy is obscured or even appears no longer possible. The endgame of this trajectory is a non-political world, which is a world whose conflicts lack the existential dimension whereby political distinctions draw their legitimacy, which is the production of a resilient political order. Schmitt's polemics against the politicizing character of liberalism are, of course, well documented and often take center stage in critical or affirmative evaluations of his work. What is, however, often overlooked are the far-reaching implications of his theory, which was not intended only to critique liberalism. Already in the first pages of the concept of the political, Schmitt anticipates the historical obsolescence of the liberal anti-interventionist state and its de facto replacement by a new form of political organization, much more relevant to 20th century democracy. This form is the total state. Although the concept of the political features the term of the total state undifferentiated, Schmitt's later elaboration between its qualitative and quantitative types suggests that it is the latter which was of concern, the quantitative, that is, which was of concern in the concept of the political. Whereas Schmitt conceives the qualitative total state as existing above society from where it can monopolize the political, the quantitative total state immerses discriminately into every domain, into every sphere of human existence. The quantitative total state violently, therefore, takes over the political vacuum of liberalism and repoliticizes all aspects of personal and collective life by facilitating the state's complete penetration of the social. He characteristically wrote, and I quote here, "What had been up to that point affairs of state become thereby social matters, and vice versa. And vice versa, what had been purely social matters become affairs of state, as must necessarily occur in a democratically organized unit. Heretofore ostensibly neutral domains, religion, culture, education, the economy, then cease to be neutral in the sense that they do not pertain, to state and to politics. As a polemical concept against such neutralizations and depoliticizations of important domains appears the total state, which potentially embraces every domain. This results in the identity of state and society. In such a state, therefore, everything is at least potentially political, and in referring to the state, it is no longer possible to assert for it a specifically political characteristic. For Schmitt, consequently, the quantitative total state presents itself as a quasi-Weberian ideal of state organization in 20th century liberal democracy, and follows the erosion or abolition of the precarious distinctions that sustained the non-interventionist character of the liberal state of 19th century, of the 19th century. The quantitative total state marks, therefore, the mass democratic subsumption of these domains of culture, economy, education, religion, in conditions of liberal political pluralism. The quantitative, therefore, total state is this synthesis of the mass democratic and the liberally plural. In this environment, the prerogative over the political becomes the arena of conflict between multiple competing entities with comprehensive ideological and executive apparatuses. The newly institutionalized rivalry between political decision, presupposes, therefore, the great expansion and diffusion of political relationships across the entire fabric of society, and the simultaneous deflation of the state's political character. As a cause and effect which collapse into one another, liberalism and the quantitative total state create the conditions for what Jacques Derrida, in his critical reading of Schmitt, has described as hyperpoliticization. The less politics there is, the more there is. The less enemies there are, the more there are. The inversion and vertigo of this proposition is the immediate effect of the constitutive logic organizing the adversarial framing of the political. The unidentifiability of the structuring enemy unleashes a multiplicity of potential new ones. So, through this, let's say, proliferation of potential new enemies which follows the unidentifiability of the structuring enemy, the subject of liberal democracy, following Schmitt's and Derrida's own line of thinking, emerges hyper-politicized and disubjectified. Caught up in sweeping processes of second-order politicization, the subject is able to recognize and represent itself only in relation to predetermined practices to which it passively gravitates and it reproduces. This would amount, of course, to an extension of the occasionalism which Schmitt himself diagnosed already in 1916 in his own political romanticism and his discussion of the subjectivity structure of liberalism. Yet, in contemporary conditions of a comprehensive colonization of every social space by the political, the subject transcends this romantic, liberal impassivity and submissiveness. The subject now finds itself consistently mobilized by perceptions of meaningful engagement with its surroundings in a public sphere that is at the same time oversaturated by small, perhaps meaningless and impactless political gestures, which cannot and perhaps are not designed to effect the merest change other than reproduce what Bourriaud would perhaps describe as the liberating claim of subjecthood. It is in this context that Nicolas Bourriaud's judgment on art's inability to go beyond a politics of display value should be understood. Through this exposition, Bourriaud's observation on the political affectations overtaking contemporary cultural production can move beyond the level of an easy reactive disavowal and return to Althusser's own theory of interpolation in the ideological production of the subject. And at this stage, my collaborator, Udith, can continue on.
Yes, can everybody hear me now? That's fine. Yeah, so just to kind of return to the fear of ideology as recounted by Althusser, and just to kind of fill in some of the blanks which exist, some of the sort of aporias that exist within Bourriaud's own kind of attempt to articulate the philosophy of Althusser. So this is the kind of most kind of famous iteration of the theory of ideology. So much of the theoretical underpinnings of the Exform hinge on Bourriaud's kind of extrapolation of this particular theory of ideology. And this is its most kind of well-known iteration, as I say, and it's from Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatuses from 1970. And its ideology is a representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. And the formulation itself is given to be framed in terms of the kind of Lacanian psychoanalytic structure, which seemingly supports and sort of engages with it, as ideology is thus a kind of symbolic representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. So each element kind of corresponds to this tripartite model of the unconscious as posited by Lacan. So implicitly for Bourriaud, such a definition must also include Althusser's kind of speculative insight on art, as Christos already kind of extrapolated on, as a kind of mediating force that makes us see, perceive, and feel without knowing the ideology from which it derives and to which it alludes. So it's now clear that this particular definition of ideology, as kind of famously attributed to Althusser, has become without question, it's certainly Althusser's most kind of famous contribution to theoretical discourse, but it's now kind of considered by many to be in no way definitive. Indeed, ideology in the ideological state apparatus is itself a very fragmentary and elliptical work, which is sutured together from various sources by the author, and it was intended to form a part of a much larger work, which was intended for a non-academic philosophical readership. Another sort of earlier intervention by Althusser in the realm of ideology is contained in his 1964 essay, Marxism and Humanism, which precipitated what was known as the very acrimonious humanist controversy that gripped French intellectual life in the period leading up to May 68 and beyond. Both texts, which were separated by a period of 6 years, 1964 to 1970, some of the most tumultuous years in recent European history, as we're well aware of, are often kind of unthinkingly considered to mark two stages in the evolution of Althusser's theory of ideology. However, Warren Montag's very brilliant and authoritative Althusser and his Contemporaries, published in 2013, has demonstrated through a very robust command of archival material that although these two texts differ significantly from one another in many crucial ways, they also share some fundamental similarities. So it's Montag's contention, third text, Free Notes on a Theory of Discourse, published in 1966, and unpublished in Althusser's own lifetime, is a kind of necessary waypoint between the first and second text, and moreover, one which kind of reveals a period of breaks, rapid breaks and reversals in Althusser's thought, and a period in which the continuity of certain terms concealed underlying theoretical discontinuities. So Montag focuses on Althusser's initial notion of ideology as a system of representations, which the philosopher later clarified as usually images and occasionally concepts. So for Montag, the foregrounding of images is highly significant, because for him, this actually constitutes the root of the imaginary relationship on which Althusser's theory of ideology in his well-known book. For Montag, the foregrounding of images is very significant because for him, it constitutes the kind of root of the imaginary relationship in Althusser's theory of ideology. In this kind of most well-known iteration here. So we'll just go back to that. So the representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. Now, for Montag, heretofore this has been considered an unfailing reference to Lacan. However, Montag is able to kind of trace this notion of the image in Althusser to a contemporary debate within French phenomenology. On the one side of this debate, there was Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and their attempt to kind of restore the image to a form of knowledge itself. And on the other hand, there was Gaston Bachelard and his previous contention that the image is instead the primary form of illusion and the main impediment to any form of knowledge, scientific knowledge more specifically. And although Althusser himself was closer to the position of Bachelard, in Marxism and Humanism, Althusser resisted association with either proposition, either camp within this particular debate, and attempted instead to advance a sophisticated conception of ideology that seemingly decenters consciousness and displaces the perceiving subject, thereby removing the significance of the image, while simultaneously attempting to conceive of ideology in material terms. So this is the quote from Marxism and Humanism, which Montag highlights. Men live their actions commonly related by the classical tradition to freedom and to consciousness in ideology, through and by ideology. In short, the lived relation of men to the world, including history in political action or inaction, passes through ideology, or better, is ideology itself. So Montag notes that both the novelty and contradiction in the above formulation derives primarily from Althusser's use in the French of le vécu, the lived relations of men to the world. Its use is the best indication of Althusser's implication within what Montag describes as the unfinished field of the Lebenswelt, as developed by Edmund Husserl in his 1936 work, The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. The Lebenswelt represents a distinct turn within the field of phenomenology and signaled for some philosophers in the Hussleyan tradition, such as Trine Ductau and Merleau-Ponty, a turn into a more materialist direction. Previously, the discipline had been concerned with exploring the functioning of consciousness in isolation, but now conceived of it as inescapably embedded within an already extant and intersubjective world of collective perception and accumulated experience. Yet, as Montag also perceptively highlights, Althusser did not merely reproduce the unresolved contradictions of Lebenswelt. In the last instance, he reverts to Spinoza in his absolute refusal to see mind and body as either distinct, neither as distinct nor as reciprocal, but as the same thing, and is thereby denying the existence of the subjectivity that is so central to phenomenology. This occurs primarily in the form of the expression, again in the French original, of men's consciousness and their attitude and conduct. So, I quote Montag, attitude and conduct, to translate Althusser's words literally, represent a substitution of body for mind, of external for internal, of acts for thoughts. To follow this set of associations is to see consciousness disappear into acts and mind into body. To replace become conscious of or experience with live, as in men live their relations to their conditions of existence, is not only to make ideology an affair of bodies rather than minds, but to materialize it altogether. For Montag, this is evidence enough that Althusser remained in part tethered to the idealist preoccupations of the phenomenological tradition, and that Marxism and humanism, and by extension the entire genealogy of his theory of ideology, is haunted, and I quote, by the humanism it sought to analyze insofar as it desubstantialized ideology and vacillated between a notion of individual subjects as given, although no longer the center of their world, and a notion of the subject as illusion. Nevertheless, this ambivalence, rather than a mere reflection of Althusser's uncertain philosophical commitments, might in fact point to a certain liminality in the very constitution of the subject of liberal democracy, of the emptiness of the subject outside of the reproduction of hollowed-out predetermined practices. Seen in this light, the vacillation described by Montag essentially underlines Althusser's own implication on the lived relation of individuals to the world, not simply as being filtered through ideology, but as ideology itself. To consider the perceptual lived relations as ideology in itself is to emphasize the spirit of Althusser's simultaneous use of and quarrel with what he believed to be the inescapable idealism of the phenomenological tradition, whilst also acknowledging the possibility that this very theory remains desubstantialized due to an unwillingness to attach to ideology the totalizing force which certain parts of ideology and ideological state apparatuses demand. Indeed, the substitution of perception as a facet of consciousness for a bodily act does not necessarily negate ideology's relation to the aesthetic, as we said in the very beginning, in its original etymological rendering, aesthetikos, which is itself a form of perception or aesthesis. So conceived in this way, art is plausibly not always only a means of making us, to use Althusser's words, see, perceive, and feel the ideology from which it derives and to which it alludes. It can also sometimes be ideology itself. So in order to arrive at such a designation, let's briefly engage with what was for Althusser the central conceptual link between psychoanalysis and the theory of ideology. And this is a link which, curiously, Bourriaud himself notably leaves unexplored. And this is the theory of interpolation. So it's our contention that there exists a conceptual gap within this theory that allows for a degree of speculation. Since, despite Althusser's insistence, the issue of whether ideology has a material or an ideal existence is never fully resolved, even in the final instance, it's difficult to accept entirely the totalizing materialist force by which ideology consistently interpolates all individuals as subjects. So we maintain that there remains the possibility of an aberrant functioning, which sometimes disrupts this process, and one which ultimately creates conditions for what we will designate as the ideological aesthetic. The central thesis posited by Althusser in his noted text on ideology is that ideology interpolates individuals as subjects. The memorable example, which some of you might be aware of, which Althusser furnishes, is the scenario of the policeman. The policeman stops an individual on the street. He shouts towards them and forces them to give an account of themselves. So in the example which he gives is that the policeman shouts, "Hey there," and 9 times out of 10, the person who's calling will turn around. So such an interpolation inevitably occurs under a certain amount of duress. It's the threat of physical violence from the policeman, of course. And the policeman, of course, is a representative, an embodiment of the repressive state apparatus. The process of interpolation, where the body of the repressive state apparatus acts upon the body of the individual, is thus given to be an entirely material process and one detached from any kind of notion of the imaginary as perception or indeed as merely consciousness. According to Althusser, this dramatic process, this calling to account by which the individual appears to become a subject of ideology, also already takes place within ideology, or as he most famously says within his essay, outside of it, since ideology is nothing but outside. And this kind of proves that individuals are always already subjects and that ideology has no origin or telos. Thus, to this initial thesis, Althusser appends another. And this is, apologies here, change the slide. Ideology acts or functions in such a way that it recruits subjects among the individuals. It recruits them all, or transforms the individuals into subjects. It transforms them all by that very process operation, which I have called interpolation. As we can see, Althusser conceives of ideological interpolation as a totalizing process composed of an act of recognition, reconnaissance in French, a term which, along with its inversion, méconnaissance or misrecognition, Althusser has all borrowed once again from the Lacanian psychoanalytic account of ego formation. This notion of recognition, as Montag notes, already presupposes a constituted subject who acts consciously and therefore possesses some degree of subjectivity. So in order to conceive of interpolation in this way, we have to return ideology to the realm of intersubjectivity, and again, to return it to the realm of the Lebenswelt, from which Althusser, through his kind of attempt to utilize Spinoza, this kind of Spinoza's materialization of ideology, had attempted to extract ideology completely from this particular realm, Marxism and humanism. So nonetheless, there remains a conflict between idealism and materialism within Althusser's theory of ideology. It remains, it rejects a kind of interiority and consciousness, yet in their place proposes this kind of functionalist account of the processes of exploitation and domination, etc. However, this conflict remains intractable only if we accept the intersubjective realm of the Lebenswelt as an entirely phenomenal and idealist one, and not, as some have previously attempted to frame it, something approaching a material one. And at this stage, it's well to note that this question remains unresolved even within contemporary discussions around phenomenology and aesthetics. Within this discussion, the aesthetic is argued to be both an idealist perceptual phenomenon, but one which also has a material existence, or to bring back what the comment by Montag, as an affair of bodies rather than minds. So this assertion is by no means as implausible as it sounds, and on the contrary, it's been quite recently, relatively recently, and convincingly argued by the German philosopher Günther Fiegel, who posits that art is no arbitrary theme of phenomenological description. Rather, an artwork is essentially phenomenal. It is an appearance that is not to be taken as the appearance of something, but instead purely as appearance. Accordingly, aesthetics essentially is phenomenology. The aesthetic, as conceived here by Fiegel, is itself an inherently phenomenological category. Yet Fiegel makes a further distinction. The aesthetic does not merely possess a phenomenological character to the extent that it is one possible form of phenomenology. aesthetics also at the same time alters phenomenology insofar as phenomena capable of being experienced aesthetically are not pure correlates of consciousness, but rather things. Artworks are thing-like. It is only for this reason that perception is essentially connected to the experience of them. So it's our contention in this essay that ideology, as conceived by Althusser in certain circumstances, becomes a phenomenon capable of being perceived purely aesthetically, but simultaneously retains a materiality that in certain circumstances remains attached to its aesthetic perception. As Althusser writes, in ideology, it is therefore not the real conditions of their own existence that men represent to themselves, but their own subjective relation to them. What we have then is a form of subjective perception as relation that Althusser maintains lies at the very center of every ideological, i.e. imaginary representation of the real world. It is this relation that contains the cause which has to explain the imaginary distortion of the ideological representation of the real world. So these two, this curious term, the cause of this imaginary distortion is here quite significant for us, because we contend it's to be found not within a process of interpolation, which seemingly recruits all subjects equally, but within the fact that its functioning is inconsistent within certain contexts. In contrast to the standard interpretation of Althusser's theory, interpolation is not uniformly tied to a positive subjection to an external authority through which the subject recognizes themselves. In a posthumously published typescript written in 1965 titled Theory, Theoretical Struggle, Theoretical Formation, Ideological Struggle, Althusser attempts to examine ideology not only in relation to recognition, but also to misrecognition. So we understand that ideological representation imparts a certain representation of reality, that it makes allusion to the real in a certain way, but at the same time, it bestows only an illusion on reality. We also understand that ideology gives men a certain knowledge, connaissance of their world, or rather allows them to recognize themselves in their world, gives them a certain recognition, like connaissance. But at the same time, ideology only introduces them to its misrecognition, méconnaissance. Illusion and illusion, or recognition, misrecognition, such as ideology from the perspective of its relation to the real. The above proposition once more brings into question this notion of interpolation as a totalizing drama of recognition, which recruits all individuals as subjects by introducing to it and associating it with the simultaneous problematic of misrecognition. The latter, which is clearly an afterthought in the above formulation, should, we feel, be understood as related to the former in terms of an occurrence that disrupts the normative functioning of interpolation. At this juncture, we can now posit the ideological aesthetic in contradistinction to the recognition proper to interpolation as it is a form of misrecognition, méconnaissance, which Jacques Lacan associated in his 1946 paper, The Presentation on Psychical Causality, with the inability of the paranoiac subject to identify with an imposed subjective identity, a condition that inevitably hastens a crisis in their psychic life. In a seminar of 1953 to 1954, Beyond Psychology, Lacan writes of misrecognition as a certain organization of affirmations and negations to which the subject is attached, that, furthermore, cannot be constituted without what he describes as correlative knowledge. If the subject is capable of misrecognition, then he must equally be capable of recognition, and thus privy to the knowledge of that which he has failed to recognize. This would seem to accord with Althusser's own view of ideology as it relates to the real, as a form of illusion, or recognition and misrecognition. This is, however, a normative view, and one which does not itself preclude the existence of an aberrant form. Indeed, in a 1946 paper, Lacan elaborates in a subsection of the essential causality of madness on the centrality of misrecognition to madness, which is apparent in the revolt through which the madman seeks to impose the law of his heart onto what seems to him to be the havoc, disorder of the world. It is an insane enterprise, in that the subject does not recognize in this havoc the very manifestation of his actual being, or that what he experiences as a law of his heart is but the inverted and virtual image of that same being. He thus doubly misrecognizes it, precisely so as to split its actuality from its virtuality. Now he can escape this actuality only via this virtuality. His being is thus caught in a circle, unless he breaks it through some form of violence, by which, in lashing out at what he takes to be the havoc, he ends up harming himself because of the social repercussions of his actions. As Lacan implies, the formation of the ego is a perilous and deceptive enterprise, and one necessarily based on misrecognition. However, through the intervention of technologies that demand constant self-observation, or rather self-surveillance, we are now forced into quotidian confrontation with this form of misrecognition, and we contend the results have been unsurprisingly pathological. The near kind of universal forms of sort of derangement and kind of mental crisis that are kind of inculcated in a great number of contemporary subjects by this kind of loop of misrecognition, where the kind of differences between virtuality and actuality are growing ever more indistinct. So there's very palpable sort of crisis within this kind of paradigm. The contemporary subject is only capable of misrecognition through these practices that possess no specific relation to themselves, but through which they're compelled to give a false account of themselves to this, to the big other, to the bourgeois big other. So through the kind of ubiquitous modes of social media as a means of communication, self-promotion, self-abjection, political mobilization and consumption, increasingly, of course, in ways that coalesce, the subject inhabits a public sphere overfilled with political gestures which furnish them with a seemingly endless flow of perceptions of genuine engagement. These perceptions may well kind of devolve into misperceptions as soon as the kind of, as their efficacy is judged against the professed political intentions and content, but they should by no means be dismissed as meaningless. In fact, they are particularly meaningful as their primary function is to entrench the representation of the self always in opposition to a perceived illusory or not hegemonic center. So within this drama of misrecognition, or as we would like to put it, misinterpolation in contradistinction to interpolation, the individual has become impervious to the policeman's demand to give account of themselves, not least because they have been conditioned into the habit of policing themselves. So the kind of liberal contemporary and the neoliberal total state has come about not through the disintegration of previous states, but through this kind of creeping supremacy of vast, borderless semio corporations. So the ideological aesthetic can therefore be framed as this kind of aberrant form of interpolation, a mutation which occurs as a kind of backsliding or regression, this kind of residual trace of this purportedly ideal immaterial form, and a degeneration or deformation of ideology into its aesthetic representation. The conditions for this mutation are provided by the emergent states of hyperpoliticization, wherein categories, conventionally political or not, are constantly remobilized, reoriented, and repurposed into the service of superstructural political divisions. Within its kind of the kind of relatively, I guess, partial functioning of this process, the hyperpoliticization created by the ideological aesthetic appears overwhelmingly negative. Historically, however, these kind of phenomena of aberrant interpolation could be explicated with recourse to what Althusser, in his kind of brief comment on Christian ideology, referred to as the bad subject. So according to Althusser, there are 4 stages to the kind of process of interpolation of the Christian ideological subject. In the first instance, there's the interpolation of the individual as subject. In the second, there's subjection to the subject with a capital S, in this case, God, or the Christian church. Thirdly, there's the mutual recognition of subjects and subject with capital S, the subject's recognition of each other, and finally, the subject's recognition of himself. This chain of interpolation ends with the absolute guarantee of these conditions which takes the form of the invocation Amen, which means literally, so be it. In contradiction to this good normative subject, the bad subject is an exception to this functioning of this ideological interpolation, who provokes the intervention of one of the detachments of the repressive state apparatus. The implication is that this bad subject had heretofore been defined by the rebellion against the authority of the church by deviating from its law, as, for example, a heretic or a sinner or an apostate. The good subjects, on the other hand, they function all by themselves through positioning themselves within an extant status quo. They must be obedient to God, to their conscience, to the priest, to the Gaul, to the boss, to the engineer. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, etc. Their concrete material behavior is simply the inscription of life of the admirable words of the prayer, Amen, so be it. So our kind of argument is in the contemporary moment, this process is beginning to be reversed. The process of neutralization now also functions for the creation of bad subjects. Those who express their putative rebellion against sometimes illusory, already kind of obsolescent ideological state apparatuses. So as Warren Montag himself kind of perceptively suggested, much of Michel Foucault's philosophical work, his oeuvre, has exerted a sometimes kind of unwieldy and palpable influence on contemporary culture to some extent. It was also a kind of unacknowledged practical exploration of Althusser's theory of ideology in relation to the history of the bad subject in a variety of contexts. But what we are now witnessing is a kind of emergent universalization of this new type of subject, a subject who misrecognizes themselves as an opposition to oppressive ideological structures, whilst blind to the kind of impossibility of rebellion that is encoded within the very means through which their rebellion is communicated. This universal bad subject has become, in actual fact and in praxis, an exemplary good subject, whose purported antagonism is continually neutralized, recuperated, and thus rendered impotent. This phenomenon, the institutionalization of oppositionality in the formation of the subject, this kind of institutionalization of anime to some extent, speaks less of an individual or collective failure or even political short-sightedness, and more of a reflexive assumption of a differential identity as the only means to guarantee a sense of self. Its kind of end game, as Jacques Rancière observed, is the impossibility of the critical universalization historically necessary for the enunciation of any sort of form of political identity. So, I mean, the kind of like the preceding analysis has been very kind of undulating to some extent, but as it kind of reveals, no doubt, a theory of the kind of ideological aesthetic has the potential to retroactively account for some of the more kind of perplexing events and phenomena in 20th century history. And I think we feel very strongly that they would furthermore be able to provide a very much fuller and more well-rendered account of our kind of very chaotic and destabilized kind of present situation, which is kind of characterized by various kind of aestheticized and sort of not merely sort of performative, but also kind of self-reflexive forms of kind of activism, et cetera, et cetera. And we believe that utility of a theory of the ideological aesthetic becomes kind of apparent when we consider it as a kind of lacuna within previous discourses on ideology and the recurrence of the kind of antagonisms which were birthed in the 20th century, for example, which was also a comparable era of bewildering and alienating technological progress, which witnessed the birth of fascism, which to some extent, which I kind of argue in my own book, which is nearing completion, was a kind of ideological aesthetic. As the kind of, as critic Jeffrey Schnapp noted, fascism necessitated an aesthetic overproduction, a surfeit of fascist signs, images, slogans, books, and buildings that compensated for, filled in, and covered up its forever unstable ideological core. And he also maintained that it ushered in a new dispensation in which all oppositions between aesthetics and politics are swept up into a new image politics. To take this kind of very valuable insight further, fascism did not simply use aesthetic production as a means of compensation for an absent political content. Rather, it was precisely those aesthetic elements, its image politics, which constituted its ideology in its entirety. Nowhere is this more evident, which I argue, than in the works of fascist modernism, which is a kind of little recognized but nonetheless distinct tradition within European modernism, from the kind of futurist novels of Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, the works of Wyndham Lewis's middle period, more specifically, the writings of Louis Ferdinand Céline, Pierre Dru La Rochelle, Henri de Montalon, Julius Evola, Ernst Junger, and Gottfried Benn. There's a marked kind of confluence of literary aesthetics and ideology that's kind of mired in often pathological modes of thinking that reproduce an array of comparable responses to the crises of their particular turbulent historical moment. So just to kind of sum up here, Walter Benjamin wrote in his 1930 review of Ernst Junger's collection, his essay collection, which he edited, that the work reflected the depraved mysticism at the heart of German fascism. In 1935, however, he wrote his most memorable lines in the epilogue to arguably his most famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Fascism sees as its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life. The violation of the masses, whom fascism with its fear cult forces to their knees, has its counterpart in the violation of an apparatus which is pressed into production of ritual values. So we propose that the ideological aesthetic in its present form as an instrument of the contemporary technological reality aestheticizes aspects of everyday life in the service of similar forms of mystification, through offering ample opportunity for the universal bad subject to give expression to their discontent. They too have become engaged in the production of ritual values, insufficient to mount any form of serious opposition to a contemporary total state, which inculcates in atomized, cyclical and self-limiting forms, something which approaches the mass hysteria once prompted by the fascist Führer cult. Whether Benjamin himself may later have become aware of these connections, we can only speculate. However, 5 years later, before penning the above, he sent a copy of his own book, The Origin of German Tragic Drama, to one esteemed Professor Schmitt, accompanied by a mildly obsequious, though nonetheless enigmatic letter. Benjamin ends by acknowledging the debt he owes to Schmitt, particularly his 1922 work, The Dictator, which Benjamin maintained, from which he derived a confirmation of my modes of research in the philosophy of art from yours in the philosophy of the state. Of course, a decade later, Benjamin was to die by his own hand, fleeing the fascist state, which Schmitt's philosophy had helped to legitimize.